Go into the developing brain. How life experiences change the brain. Overview for our talk this afternoon. Okay, so overview, we're going to look at the brain. Then we're going to look at parental environmental influences that affect the brain, media influences that affect the brain, spiritual influences, and then how to develop a healthy brain. So, anybody recognize this picture? Yes, did anybody remember this a few years back? This was Jeopardy, the television program on trivia of lots of detail. This is Ken Jennings and Brad Ritter, not related to me. And this was Watson. Watson is IBM's synthetic computer, and they competed. These are the two all-time human winners, and they competed against each other in a 3-day tournament to see who would win, human brain power or IBM computing power. Anybody know who won? Yeah, Watson won. Watson won. Let's look at this. Watson is made out of 90 of these IBM servers, Power 750 servers, which have 280 Power 7 processors, each processor with 8 cores containing 1.2 billion transistors, or 27,648 transistors. Has 16 terabytes of RAM with 500 gigabytes per second processing, which means 1 million books per second. Now, which would you prefer? Okay, you're not. Maybe some people are not sure. Okay, let's put it in perspective. This is perspective. That's the approximate size difference between the two. There's the brain. There's IBM's power server. Okay. Now let's just do a comparison. Watson weighs 10,000 pounds. The brain weighs 3 pounds. And the brain, even though it weighs 3 pounds, it's 1 to 2% of the body weight. It uses 20% of the body's energy. Highly active organ, but it weighs 3 pounds compared to Watson's 10,000 pounds. The brain has 100 billion nerve cells with over 1 trillion supporting cells, and each brain cell neuron can have up to 10,000 connections, so 40 quadrillion connections in the brain. Let me walk through so you get some perspective on what these numbers mean. A kilobyte equals 1,000 individual bits of information. So an individual, like a single zero is 1 bit of information. A 1 is 1 bit of information. A kilobyte is 1,000 individual bits of information. A megabyte is 1,000 kilobytes, or 1 million bytes of information. A gigabyte is 1,000 megabytes, or 1 trillion bytes of information. And a terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes of information. And what's that next number? 1 quadrillion? What is it? It's a lot, yeah. Am I on again now? Okay, alrighty. And then a teraflop is 1 trillion point operations per second. That's the processing speed, that you can process 1 trillion points of information per second. That's a teraflop. So brain holds approximately 1.25 terabytes of information and performs at 100 teraflops. That's the human brain right now, okay? This is brilliant. This is amazing. And Watson, 1 terabyte of data and performs at 80 teraflops. Your human brain, 3 pounds, way outperforms Watson. Well, then why did Watson win? Because if you know about Jeopardy, it's not what you know, it's who rings in. And they had it set up. You can't ring in. They have the ringers blocked until Alex finishes his question. And as soon as the switch was flipped to open the ringers, Watson was wired in, and he had an electronic solenoid. Boom! He could hit instantly to ring in, so he rang in faster. That's all. That's the only reason, because the way he was set up, he didn't have a finger. He had an electronic solenoid coming from that's it. He could ring in faster. Not that he knew more. So that's why he won. The human brain can move. Watson cannot move. The human brain can feel, see, smell, taste. Watson cannot. The human brain can rewire itself based on experience. We're going to go through that in a minute. Watson cannot. The human brain can make new components, build new neurons. Watson cannot. Experience changes the structure of the brain. Watson's structure does not change. Which is more complex? way intricately, infinitely more complex. You understand the human brain is a brilliant piece of engineering. It's incredible. Does anybody think that Watson was found after an explosion in an IBM factory? Pardon? No, you know this idea there's an explosion and then we eventually found our human brains. Okay. Normal brain development. The human brain is so complex that over 50% of your genome, if you look at all the genes in the human genome, over 50% of them code for the human brain. It's only 3 pounds, but more than half of the DNA codes for that 3 pounds, 1 to 2% of your body. During fetal development, there's a portion of during fetal development where 50,000 neurons are being produced per second. More than twice as many neurons are produced than are eventually used. So from birth to 8 years of age, this is critical if you understand, first 8 years of life, there's massive remodeling of the child brain going on with millions of neurons being deleted in the first 8 years of life. Now this first doesn't sound too good, but conceptualize it as Michelangelo's block of marble when Michelangelo gets it, and Michelangelo's block of marble when he's done with it. When he's done, he has less marble, doesn't he? But now he has a masterpiece. The human brain comes into the world prepared to be acted upon by education, environment, and experience, and neural circuits which are firing and being used will expand, but neural circuits which are left dormant and not used will actually be pruned back and deleted. This is normal. So you may have heard cases of children who are locked away in a cage somewhere, no one ever spoke language to them, and they're rescued in their teen years. They never can learn to speak. The most they get is 50-word vocabulary. Because the neurons for language were not used, the brain deleted them. So this is normal. Keep this in mind when we talk about the other things that happen, because you think about what your child is being exposed to, what neural circuits are being activated and firing during childhood, their brain structure is changing based on that. Then there's a second wave of neurogenesis that hits and peaks in girls at age 11 and boys at age 12, followed by several more years of massive remodeling that happens. Anybody have a guess as to why this peaks at this point, followed by remodeling? Puberty. This is preparing for secondary sexual development. And this is a vulnerable time period. So if children at this age, from the age of 11 to 12, maybe up to about 16 to 18, somewhere in those years, go through sexual experiences that are deviant in some way and don't experience negative consequence. They only get gratification from it. This is how paraphilias are often laid down, or the sexual perversions are laid down, because the brain is wiring in what is arousing and what is pleasurable sexually during this time frame. And so kids can get caught into pornography and some of these behaviors at this time. They can be very incalcitrant and can struggle with this their whole life. It's a very vulnerable period. White matter maturation progresses from the back of the brain to the front of the brain, and the last part of the brain to mature. White matter maturation is basically the insulation on the neurons that allow rapid firing and communication between the neurons. And the last part of the brain to mature is the prefrontal cortex, the part where you reason and think and self-restrain and self-govern. That's why kids in their early adolescence are impulsive and moody and irrational and don't often make a lot of sense. And it doesn't finish, your brain doesn't finish maturing until age around 25. So when adolescents were shown faces and asked to identify the emotions, the younger teens activated their amygdala, their mood circuits, and limbic system, whereas the older teens activated their prefrontal cortex. So just showing that different parts of the brain are activating as they're maturing. So brain circuits, this is just to remind you what we went over this morning. If you remember, the amygdala is the fire alarm. When it activates, when it fires, it calls the 911 operator, which is your hypothalamus, which calls in emergency responders from your adrenal glands, your adrenaline and glucocorticoids, which signal your fire chief, your hippocampal neurons, which tell the amygdala to hold things in check. And then you have your administrator dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which evaluates whether it's a real alarm or not and can shut the whole system down, shut the alarm down by the conclusions drawn. That's a car backfiring, or that's just a rubber hose, that type thing. Okay. Didn't that go a lot faster that time? Yeah. Okay. So just remember those neural circuits because they're very important. Remember because if in childhood activities are happening that are significantly activating these limbic system circuits, these mood circuits down here, to be growing. Those circuits are going to be expanding. If activities are happening that are keeping these inactive, they're not going to die per se, but they're not going to develop, expand, and there'll be pruning back that happens. There won't be like a stroke or anything happening there. They just won't develop the neural complexity of the higher cortex, and they won't have the capacity for self-governance they might otherwise have later in life. So activities will shape the brain depending on what you experience in childhood. So now let's look at Section 2, parental. With all that in mind, kind of background on the brain, now let's look at the parental environmental influences. So first, parents influence through heredity, and then through environment, behavioral, social environment. So let's look at heredity. I think it's what we're going to do first. And there we go. Has anybody heard the term epigenetics? Epi means like epidermis. It means above. The high layer of the skin is epidermis. So above, genetics is your DNA. So epigenetics is what sits above the DNA. Now, Conrad Waddington in 1957 observed that every cell of your body, other than your red blood cells, has a nucleus, and in the nucleus is DNA with the exact same DNA in every cell. But your skin cells are different than your bone cells, which are different than your retina cells, which are different than your brain cells, which are different than your liver cells, which are different than your muscle and your heart cells. So all these cells have the exact same DNA, but they're all different. So he hypothesized there must be some set of instructions that instruct the DNA in the different cells to activate different sections of the DNA and express themselves differently. So he coined this term epigenetics. Epi, it means above. And so the epigenetics means and we're going to look at the transgenerational, gestational, and environmental influence of how this set of instructions that sit above the DNA can be altered by experience. Now these are two mice. How closely related? You guys can think about this. Are these just two members of the same species? Are these parent and child? Are these cousins? Are these brother and sister from the same litter? Are these clones, identical twins, clones? You think about that. And here is a graphic demonstration of DNA, double helix. You know, double helix of DNA is two strands that are joined together, wrapped around histones, packed into chromatin, which are packed ultimately into chromosomes, in order for the DNA to express itself. And this is just a set of instructions. It's code is what it is. And the code instructs for everything that you are physiologically is in the code. And how this code, in order to express itself, this has to unwind, has to unzip, and then the code can be read. Well, this can be modified, epigenetic modification, in two places. These little MEs stand for methyl groups. Methyl groups can attach to these areas on the DNA, and when it does, it basically locks that portion of the DNA down. That portion of the DNA can no longer unzip, okay? And so if it can't unzip, it can't express itself, so it can shut down. And then when it's wrapped around the histones, acetyl groups and methyl groups can attach here and can also lock down or enhance expression. It can go either way depending on which way it's done. So you can alter how the DNA is being expressed by these groups that attach above the DNA. So let me show you some studies that show what's going on. So fruit flies were exposed to an antibiotic called geldamycin, and those exposed to the geldamycin had these bulging outgrowths on their eyes. What happened next, though, is that those bulging outgrowths were experienced or seen in the subsequent 13 generations, even though there was no DNA sequence change, all the DNA, there's no mutation of the DNA sequence, and none of the other generations, 2 through 13, were exposed to geldamycin. So what this means is that exposure caused an epigenetic modification in how the DNA was being expressed, which passed down 13 generations. Roundworms were fed a particular type of bacteria that caused the loss of fluorescent protein and small dumpy appearance that lasted 40 generations. No DNA sequencing change, so there's no mutation, and the subsequent generations were not fed the bacteria. So one exposure changed for 40 generations what the kids went through, if you're a worm. All right, transgenerational effects on food. These are actually human studies now. Grandfathers who had short food supply, this would be people who were, for instance, World War II, concentration camps and stuff like this, where they went through a period of time in their early years before they had kids, had short food supply. conferred greater mortality risks on their grandsons, but not their granddaughters. And grandmothers who had the same short food supply conferred greater mortality risk on their granddaughters, but not their grandsons. This was a XY, specific chromosomal alterations of the X and Y chromosome, but not the DNA sequence. It was epigenetic modification of how those genes were expressed on those chromosomes. Men who smoke cigarettes before the age of 11 increased obesity in their sons, but not their daughters. This was Y chromosome epigenetic modification. Again, no DNA sequence changed. It was how the genes were being expressed was altered by smoking the cigarettes. And so a lot of kids will say, hey, it's my body, I can do what I want. Not if you plan on having kids. You're going to affect yourself, your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids are all going to be changed by what you're doing to yourself. Gestational factors. Smoking while pregnant results in smaller babies, increased risk of sudden infant death syndrome, learning and behavior problems, increased psychotic disorders later in life. If a woman drinks while pregnant, increased risk of psychosis in her children. This is interesting. There's an epigenetic modification in the taste buds of the fetus, such that if mother drank alcohol while she was pregnant with you, you will find alcohol tastes better than if she didn't drink alcohol when she was pregnant with you. So your taste buds will be altered by that, which increases your risk of becoming an alcoholic. Mental retardation is increased, multiple organ defects, fetal alcohol syndrome. But what happens, and that's all, we get that, heavy alcohol use is going to cause these problems. But what happens if somebody drinks one glass of wine, just one glass of wine a week or less? No more than one glass of wine a week while pregnant. That's really not going to be a problem, is it? Actually, shorter children with smaller heads, more behavior problems later in life, and more delinquency from school, and more emotional problems than if mother had never drank. One glass of wine or less per week. Mother's intake of mercury and fish oil. A study of 400 children over the age of 8 found that children whose mothers had mercury levels of 1 microgram per gram had higher rates of ADHD than children whose mothers did not. And children whose mothers had ate fish at least twice per week had lower rates of ADHD than children's mothers did not. And that has to do with omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3 fatty acids are actually essential nutrients for neuronal membrane integrity. That's the membranes of which neurons are built. They're required for healthy neuronal membranes, but our bodies cannot make them. So if we don't get them in foods, we don't have them, and neuronal membrane integrity is altered, neuronal health is altered, IQ is affected if kids don't get omega-3s, and you can't get the omega-3s, the form the brain needs in plant sources. Fish oils. Some people say flax. Flax has omega-3 called ALA. It's a short chain. Brain doesn't use it. The brain uses EPA and DHA, and the brain can only convert about 1% of ALA into the form the brain needs, and that's not enough for the brain to actually get what it needs. Okay, so back to these. What do you think? Mom, daughter, son, siblings, what? These are clones. They're exactly identical clones. That's what these are. Well, what's the deal? They're clones with the exact same genome. They're like identical twins. They look identical to you? No, but they are identical twins. So what happened? They have one single gene called the agouti gene. If that gene is turned on, if it's expressed, then they are obese, blonde, and diabetic. If it's shut down, they are thin, brown, and non-diabetic. That single gene, if it's expressed. What turns on the agouti gene? And then you can see some of these have partial penetration. So some of the cells in the body have it turned on, some of the cells don't. Bisphenol A, which is a byproduct of plastic. So if you eat canned food, you have all cans with canned food are lined with plastic so the food doesn't eat out and rust the can. So if you eat canned foods, you drink stuff out of bottles. Now you'll notice it's in the last year and a half or so, a lot of manufacturers, particularly of children's things, will say things on there, no bisphenol A. You'll actually say it. You've seen some of this on the labels recently? Because it increases the risk of these problems, you see. So, but all bisphenol A in cans, plastic in teeth, this kind of thing. So what turns off the agouti gene? It will shut it. So if it's expressed, you get this obese, diabetic, blonde. For the mouse, it doesn't turn humans blonde. Shoot, she said. Okay. So what turns off the agouti gene, though? What turns it off? Methylation. Methylation, so methyl group attaches to the gene region that codes for this, and that methyl group will lock it down or shut it down. And mother's diet supplemented with folic acid and B12. So these mice with this agouti gene turned, these fat diabetic mice, were given diets with folic acid and B12, and then got pregnant and continued with the folic acid and B12 through the pregnancy. The pups were born with the gene shut off, brown, non-diabetic, thin. And the diet of the mother and the pregnant changed the gene expression, and the methyl lockdown passed down 3 and 4 generations, even though none of the subsequent offspring were given diets rich in folic acid and B12. So the diet of mom altered her kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, and great-great-grandkids. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. Okay, so what about human studies now? Netherlands, World War II, severe food shortage, children born during the food shortage, so mom gets pregnant, and there's about 500 calories a day, 400 to 500 calories a day is all that's available. Mom gets pregnant, and if they were born in that situation, those children ended up having higher rates of diabetes, obesity, and metabolic problems later in life than the siblings of the same parents. Why? Because what's happening is there's a severe food shortage. There's a severe shortage of caloric energy coming into mom while the child is developing inside. So there's a signal being sent to the developing child. You're coming out into a world where there's very little nutrition to sustain you. And so epigenetic modification happens where they have permanently downregulated metabolism. And then the war is over and they get normal nutrition, but their body is set up to survive on 400 or 500 calories. They eat normal calories, end up obese and diabetic. Aren't we marvelously made, though? You know, God made us in His image with the ability to make beings in our image. The decisions we make actually alter the types of children we have. We change ourselves. So what if mother is highly stressed during pregnancy? She's pregnant and something stressful happens, and it may not be any fault of her own, or she just could be a worrier and never learn not to worry. It could be either way, but it could be husband was deployed in the military and he's in a war zone while she's pregnant, and it's not her fault, but she's going to be stressed. What happens? Mother's stress hormones, the glucocorticoids, cross the placental barrier, cross the developing blood-brain barrier, alter the developing brain, so it interferes with the braking mechanism on the stress circuits of the brain. So the children, and this occurs through epigenetic modification, so the children are born more stress-prone, irritable, moody, and they pass this along to their children unless new experiences alter their expression before they have kids. So in other words, their start point in life will be upregulated, they'll be more anxious and irritable children than they would have otherwise been had mom not been stressed during pregnancy. Now, that's not the end of their life. What happens from this point, well, wherever their start point is, will either cause more anxiety and stuff, or will start calming the circuitry down depending on what happens next. So then we'll look at what happens next. Animal studies on parental influences. Pups of nurturing mothers, mothers who were licking and grooming, compared to pups of mothers who were neglect mothers. They didn't lick and groom these pups, were looked at. Pups without attentive mothers had altered brain development such that they had overactive amygdalas and they were more anxious and they were socially impaired than pups of mothers who groomed. Well, some may say, well, hey, this might be genetic. I mean, maybe the mothers are socially anxious and they have a genetic flaw and they pass that along, and that's why moms aren't licking and grooming. So they took pups of socially neglect moms and put them in with the attentive moms who would lick and groom them, and when they did, their brain development was normal. So it was not genetic. It was the actual attention that happens in the cuddling, the holding, the loving, the nurturing alters the infant brain. And if you don't provide that, then the infant brain will have more anxiety and upregulation of the fear circuitry. But if you provide it, it'll start down-regulating it and calming it. Child abuse and gene expression in brain tissue. 41 Canadian men, 25 were survivors of severe abuse, 16 were controls. These were all people who died. They looked at the DNA from the hippocampal region of their brain, and there were 362 epigenetic differences between those who had survived abuse compared to those who did not. 248 hypermethylated and 114 hypomethylated, not enough methyl groups there. The most significant were those genes that controlled neuroplasticity, the ability for the brain to grow new neurons and make new connections. There was a study of McGill University, 24 suicides, 12 with history of abuse, 12 without. They looked at the NR3C1 gene expression in the brain which is suppressed in children who are abused. It was shut down. This gene was turned off, and this gene is critical to stress management and may alter how people cope with stress because it's shut down. So if they go through these types of abuse history, again, gene alteration happens, and our ability to handle amount of stress is impaired. Brain changes based on environment. So, 25-year study funded by the National Institute of Mental Health found that family conflict and violence, the youth appeared to be more affected by conflict in the home than marital disruption, divorce, or separation. So the study, and this has been repeated in other studies, it's more damaging to children's brains and their ultimate function, and they end up with more disability if they stay in homes in which mom and dad stay married and there's conflict. Mom and dad are constantly arguing and fighting than if mom and dad should divorce and there's peace in both homes. So the best thing, and I can tell you, you can actually stratify this, the best home for children is a home with mother and father in which there's love, nurturance, support, healthy boundaries. That is clearly, hands down, the best home for children's brains. The next best home, though, is single-parent homes in which there's love, nurturance, support, and security in those homes. The next best home would be the married couple where there's conflict, and the worst home is a single-parent home where there's constant fighting and conflict. Females had a higher rate of alcohol disorders and lower grades in school when they were in homes where there was constant parental fighting. And males exposed to family conflict and violence increased suicidal thoughts, depression, emotional behavior problems, drug dependence, and post-traumatic stress disorder type symptoms. So let me back up. So what happens in the brain in abuse environments? Well, what circuits do you think get fired in an abuse environment? Your fear circuitry gets fired, okay? So I want you to imagine this scenario right now. I want you to imagine that you believe, you're convinced that at any moment somebody could come in here and beat you severely or rape you. And with that threat hanging over your head, that could happen any second, you've got to take your final exams in school. Do you think your exam scores could be affected? And you have a developed prefrontal cortex. What about a child whose prefrontal cortex is undeveloped, growing up in a home which at any moment mommy or daddy could beat them or one of them could molest them at any moment? And that's the environment in which they grow up. Do you think their brain structure and development will be affected? Absolutely. They get overdeveloped fear circuitry and underdeveloped prefrontal cortex circuitry. And they end up, when they come into adulthood, moody, impulsive, and they have very irrational thought processes and impaired ability to govern, self-govern, and self-regulate. It doesn't mean they can't be helped. They can. I help people like this all the time. But we have to understand what the problems are, and that these people come into adulthood with many deficiencies that they themselves did not choose. And so we have to approach them with compassion and love, but also truthfully and honestly, and they need to know what they're up against because their brain is still pliable and changeable, and if we start exercising these cortices here and calm these, brain will change in positive ways, despite their starting point. Okay. So if amygdala keeps firing, I mentioned this to you in our lecture this morning, so I won't go over it again, but bottom line is the amygdala keeps firing. It activates peripherally your immune response. Your immune response kicks up those inflammatory cascades. Those inflammatory cascades interfere with insulin signaling and synaptic signaling. And if I were to take a syringe and inject you with this a syringe full of the inflammatory cytokines, within a few hours you'll start experiencing aches and pains all over your body, nausea, sleep disturbance, concentration impairment, and a severe fatigue and malaise. And those are the symptoms of depression, because depression has this going on in it when people are depressed. Okay. This is a study. It's a very powerful study. If anybody knows about studies, this is a prospective study rather than a retrospective study. And what that means is they took over 800 individuals and they followed them for 32 years. And they identified in these 800 individuals 3 measures of childhood adversity: either overt physical or sexual abuse, neglect, or severe socioeconomic deprivation. If you had none of those, you're in the blue bar. If you had one of those, you're in the green bar. If you had 2 or more, you're in the gray bar. And then over the next 32 years, they actually followed who actually got depression, who actually got a measure of inflammation called C-reactive protein, and who actually had diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, and obesity. So this isn't looking back and remember, this is actually what happened. And what happened was, if you had none of those, about 12% developed depression, 20% if you had one of those, and if you had 2 or more, 30% developed depression. And about the same if you had 0 or 1 on this marker of inflammation, but if you had 2, it was about 35% of the individuals with 2 of those had inflammatory markers. And then if you look at the metabolic clustering of diabetes, obesity, hypercholesterolemia, it looks just like depression. 12% if you had none, 20% if you had 1, 30% if you had 2 or more. So what's happening here is that that cascade that I walked you through this morning, where you have this changing brain, where you ultimately upregulate the amygdala and fire the circuitry chronically, you're firing that inflammatory cascade in the body, which is causing all those negative consequences to the body that result ultimately in illness and physical and health problems later. So children who were abused have higher rates of medical illnesses later in life, have higher mental illness later in life, have higher rates of suicide, higher alcohol and drug problems than those who were not. Now some good news. This is all kind of negative stuff. Now, we have some mice who are engineered to be stupid. They were actually genetically built to have a gene that causes them to not be able to learn and have memory problems. They were genetically created to be stupid. And then they took these mice during 2 weeks of their adolescence, these mice with this genetic problem, and they put them in an enriched environment for 2 weeks during their adolescence. This is an enriched environment for a mouse. Lots of toys and textures and things to play with for 2 weeks in their cage. Then, it's not surprising, compared to the controls who did not have an enriched environment, which were genetically identical, these that had the enriched environment had better memory than those who didn't have the enriched environment. That doesn't surprise anyone. We would expect that. Here's where the surprise comes, or the interesting part. The offspring of these who had the enriched environment had normal memory, no memory deficits, despite them not having an enriched environment. So because mom and dad had an enriched environment, had improved memory, they have this gene defect. When they had kids, the kids got the defective gene, but it had been epigenetically modified and it had been turned off. So they had normal memory. And this is, so the environment caused epigenetic change which passed on to the offspring in a positive way, given a positive outcome. So, and what happened was histone acetylation in that gene region happened, which actually shut down that defective gene, so that defective gene was not expressed in the offspring. Isn't that pretty cool? Yeah. So protective factors, family member confidence. If a child grows up in a home where they have somebody they can feel comfortable confiding in, talking to about the things on their heart, this was significantly protective and resulted in overall improved behavioral outcomes than those children who didn't have a family member confident. Females at age 18 who had family member confident had higher self-esteem, reduced risk of major mental disorders, less suicide thoughts, less depression, less drug disorders, and overall better behavior. And then males with advice-giving family members had better school performance, lower dropouts from school, less depression, less behavior and emotional problems. And then family cohesion, that's that sense that we're for each other. We've got each other's back. We're on each other's side. I can feel safe because somebody's watching out for me. That family cohesion, males and females had higher grades, greater likelihood to receive school and community honors, and reduced risk of numerous problems and so forth. In other words, you turn out healthier when you have this structured and healthy, loving, supportive environment. So other environmental factors, tobacco, alcohol, and marijuana. Let's see, tobacco, nicotine binds to the receptor that regulates neurodevelopment, and teens who smoked have higher rates of psychosis if you smoke, higher rates of agoraphobia and panic, higher rates of depression, die from from medical complications, and have more difficult time quitting later. If you smoke at an early age, you actually have a significantly more upregulated reward circuitry for nicotine, which makes the withdrawal much more difficult to go through than if you smoke later in life. Alcohol. The average age of the first drink for an American is age 12. 20% of teenagers between 12, so it's 1 in 5 between 12 and 20 are binge drinkers. And binge meaning they drink till they pass out or are completely drunk and can't function. Adolescent drinkers scored worse than non-users on vocabulary, general information, memory retrieval, and at least 3 other tests of cognition. Their brains are not doing well. They perform worse in school, are more likely to fall behind, have increased risk of social impairments, depression, suicidal thoughts, and violence than those who don't drink. Alcohol affects sleep cycle, resulting in impaired memory and learning, and disrupts the release of normal hormones necessary for growth and maturation. And alcohol increases the risk of stroke. in young people. I won't go into all this detail. Let's just suffice it to say that there's actually a Y peptide that gets altered in the amygdala. Amygdala is your fear circuitry, and when you drink, this Y peptide is epigenetically modified, and it increases your sense of anxiety. So basically, when you drink, you get the anxiolytic relaxation effect, and then after you're done drinking, the Y peptide has been altered, and you get actually higher rates of anxiety than if you hadn't drunk, which makes you want to drink more. Marijuana increases the risk of psychotic disorders up to 40%. So if you smoke marijuana, increased risk of psychosis by 40%. Damages white matter tracts in the brain. These are the tracts that connect things together so you can communicate neuron to neuron. Impairs prefrontal cortex function. And study done at Duke University found that people who drink before the age of 18 have an 8-point drop in IQ that never fully recovers. Let me tell you the significance of that. 8-point drop, let's say IQ of 100 is the 50th percentile, meaning that basically 50% of people are dumber than you and 50% of people are smarter than you. That's 50th percentile. You're right in the middle. That's a score of 100. If you drop 8 points, you end up at 92. That drops you down to the 29th percentile. 71% of the people in society are now smarter than you are, and it never fully recovers. So has California made it legal yet? Marijuana? And let me tell you something, I'm going to be very clear with you. Giving marijuana to people with mental health problems is like giving cigarettes to people with COPD, with lung disease. It is damaging. It should be medical malpractice and their license should be removed. If they're prescribing it for mental health problems, for anxiety, for depression, for bipolar, for any of these disorders, they should be disciplined and their license should be removed. This is my opinion. State boards are not even talking about this issue. And I have patients, because I consult on telemedicine in Washington, that come from various states where it's legal for medical purposes, and they have their marijuana card for their anxiety disorder. They can't get well because it damages prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is what modulates mood, what processes and calms limbic system circuitry. So they're destroying the very circuits they need to actually resolve their anxiety disorder. Yes? Yes, and that was the initial reason, and it was a pretext to make it legal so everybody who wants it can get their card and smoke it anyway. Does anybody in this room believe that the only people getting marijuana in this state are people with terminal cancer who can't eat without it? It was all pretext. It was all scam. Yeah, let them pass the law, go back. You can only have this if you have terminal cancer and can't eat without it, then you can have it, and restrict it to that only, and then take license away and put doctors in prison and you'll find overnight there will be protest stations out. They'll be on the strike because people now have scammed the system and they're getting their marijuana. Now, this is a different issue than whether society should legalize it like they do cigarettes and alcohol. Cigarettes and alcohol are damaging to our health. Okay, here's the difference. I'm not arguing whether it should be legal or not legal. That's up to society to decide. That's a different discussion. I was arguing about whether it's healthy or not healthy. I don't care what law. You can't pass a law to make cigarette smoking healthy. We in California have decided to legislate that cigarette smoking will give you good health. Okay, legislate it, but see what happens. You cannot legislate marijuana is healthy for the brain. You can't do it. You can make it legal to use, but you're going to damage brains if you use it. That's all that I was arguing. And I think there can be a place for mercy's sake, and the fact that Scripture gives the principle for this in Proverbs 31, where it says, give beer to those who are perishing, wine to those who are dying, that they might forget their misery. Basically, those who are in some terminal, painful state and can't recover, give them something to relieve their misery. Absolutely. And if that's necessary, I don't have a problem with that. That's compassion. But we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that this becomes a panacea that can be used across society to treat all these other conditions. It's not. All right, media influences. Media in your child. Babies under age of 1 in the United States watch approximately 1 hour or more of TV per day, under the age of 1. 7 studies have confirmed that babies who watch TV before the age of 2, any television watching before the age of 2, including baby Einstein, that's why it's gone, baby Einstein is gone, delays language development. Do you remember the fad of baby Einstein? Get your baby on all this stuff and they're going to be a smart baby, blah, blah, blah. No. All the studies showed, 7 different studies showed if you did that, any TV watching before the age of 2 delays language development. There's no studies that show that TV watching of educational material under 2 has any benefit. None show that. Children get greater than 6 hours per day of electronic media. TV, music, video games, computers, text, tweets, cell phones, 6 hours or more per day of this stuff. "50% of teens have a TV in their bedroom. And I absolutely do not advocate for this. Teens should never have a TV in their bedroom. First thing, and parents, if your kids have a TV in their bedroom, pull it. This is not a punishment, it's not a discipline, it's a correction of an error on your part. It's not a punishment. You're not punishing them, you're not disciplining them, you just say, Daddy made a mistake, and I'm sorry. Seriously, you apologize. It's like, I blew this one. And I'm going to correct it. I love you enough to be man enough to say, I didn't understand, I made a mistake, and I'm pulling this because I love you. And then let them pout and protest for the next 2 weeks, which they'll do. But you still don't give it back. Take it out of the bedroom. I'm not saying that you say they can't watch any TV, but you pull it from the bedroom. Media and your child still. Average American teen watches over 200,000 acts of violence. 15,000 sexual acts per year on TV. 2,000 beer and wine commercials per year. Children don't differentiate the difference between reality and TV, and they can't distinguish the qualitative differences in information. In other words, they believe what's happening on TV is accurate representation of the world around them. So if it happens on TV, that's the way the world works, and if everybody's having sex at school and I'm not, I must be the weird one and the one that's not doing things right. I need to find somebody. This is what they think. They're the weird one. They're the one that's not doing it. Media constantly normalizes and bombards teens with sex, and teens think it's normal and they should be doing it, yeah. And teen programming has more sexual content than adult programming. Believe it or not, you haven't watched teen programming, it does. But less than 10% of it shows responsible behavior. So 90% is irresponsible sexual conduct. Television impact on the brain. What is theatrical? And we're talking now theatrical television. It will alter the developing brain. How? Well, theatrical television has its primary effect to activate your mood circuit, your limbic system, while simultaneously turning off prefrontal cortex. Think about the programs you enjoy watching. When you're watching your theatrical entertainment, it wants to get an emotional reaction out of you. It wants to get you to laugh. It wants to get you to cry. It wants to get you stressed and anxious. It wants to get you irritated and frustrated. It wants to get you aroused. It wants to get some emotional reaction. And the stronger the reaction, the better the programming, while simultaneously turning off your reasoning powers. And if you think I'm kidding, next time you watch one of your favorite shows, engage your reasoning and start thinking, hey, what's the likelihood this could really happen? If you do, you're going to ruin your shows. Does anybody remember the show that was on a few years back called 24? Yeah, I never liked that show. It was stupid. But some of my friends loved it, and on occasion I'd be visiting them, and they'd have it on. And I remember one season went something like this, if you ever watched it. Every episode was 24 episodes. Each episode is 1 hour in 1 day, is the idea. 24 is the premise. And one season went like this, that this illegal alien terrorist enters our country, infiltrates a high-security facility where he's able to access secret military hardware and software. He gets a hold of a stealth cruise missile. From another facility, his cronies get a nuclear weapon. He's able to bring the two of them together at a farm in the Midwest, marry them up, get them to talk to each other, program them with these secret codes, fire them against one of our cities, and blow up one of our cities. All in a 24-hour period. You can barely come through customs in 24 hours. I mean, think about that. And I said, this is ridiculous. And they go, I put the word, you're not supposed to think about it. Yes. You're supposed to turn off your brain. That's what you do. And this is what most of theatrical entertainment does. It requires that you not think. And so the more television you watch, the more you suspend these circuits and the more you activate these circuits. So kids who watch a lot of TV actually physiologically enter adolescence with a different brain, with a brain that's upregulated in its mood circuitry, downregulated in its prefrontal cortex, so they can't modulate their moods well, and so they're more moody, they're more irritable, they're more impulsive, they're more likely to act out aggressively and sexually, and they don't have the prefrontal cortex to calm them, so they often look to alcohol and drugs to calm them because they can't calm themselves. Now, many people believe the problem with television watching is content-driven. Content-driven. Bad, R-rated programming, you get bad content in, bad content. Certainly, it's a magnifier. But I'm going to show you the primary issue is the media itself. It alters the brain structure, and this is why this happens. This was a study done by Centerwall. He wanted to see if there's an association between violence and television watching, and so he chose 3 societies to evaluate. The United States and Canada allowed television into our society in 1945. South Africa had no television in the whole country until 1974. He chose Canada in addition to the United States because Canada has very strict gun control laws, and he didn't want any uptick in homicide rates, and he looked at a black and white indicator of homicide of violence, which is homicide, murder rates in society. So he included Canada because they have strict gun control laws and didn't want any increase in murder in the U.S. to be attributed to easy access to guns. And then in South Africa, he looked at white-on-white only homicide to take out the apartheid tensions that were going on during those years. And this is what he discovered. From 1945 to 1974, homicide rates in the United States went up 93%. In Canada, they went up 92%. And in South Africa, during the same time, they dropped by 7%. Here's the kicker. Then he looked at homicide rates in South Africa from 1974 to 1987 after television came in. Again, white-on-white only homicide jumped 130%. Now, what was the television programming on in the United States between 1945 and 1974? Can anybody tell me? I love Lucy, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, Gilligan's Island, Car 54, Ozzie and Harriet. What's all of it get rated? G rating, 93% rise in homicide rates with G-rated programming. Did the programming get worse after 74? Notice we have a magnifying effect. It magnifies the effect, but it's not the cause. It's not primary. The primary cause is neurobiologic. You get a different brain with less capability to restrain oneself and more irritability and moodiness. This was repeated in a study in 2007 with Dr. Zimmerman and Christaki. They looked at violent television, R-rated programming. They looked at non-violent theatrical programming, G-rated programming, and they looked at educational programming, basically History Channel, Sesame Street, stuff that actually engages your thought process, not entertainment, but thought-driven, and to see if there was actually an effect on attention, ADHD-like symptoms, which is a measure of prefrontal cortex function. And in fact, theatrical programming, violent or non-violent, R or G, altered attention, impaired prefrontal cortex function, did not have that impairment with educational program. So it's not the actual machine. See, if we're creating a DVD here of what we're doing this weekend and you want to show somebody that on your TV, it's not going to damage their brain. This is educational programming. It's going to cause them to think. But theatrical programming, even G-rated, is going to have this effect. And it affects all brains the same. Your adult brain gets affected the same way, but if your adult brain is already built in a healthy way, it's more resilient than a developing, undeveloped brain. It's going to be more vulnerable to this. But if you still watch a lot of programming, I'll give you an example. How many of you all watched the movie Saving Private Ryan? Come on, you can be honest here. We won't stone you. Okay? Saving Private Ryan, based on a true story of this brother who had, I think, 4 brothers killed, and he was the last of the 5, and they sent in a squad to get him in. And do you remember the opening scene in that movie, which was a reproduction of Normandy Landing? If you were eating popcorn when that started, what happened? Did you put it down? Most people, in that opening scene, the first time they see it, if we were to take your heart rate and blood pressure and draw your stress hormone levels, what will we find? Your heart rate went up, your blood pressure went up, and we would have elevated glucocorticoids and stress hormones. You're watching a movie. Your body is responding, your brain is responding as if you're going through the stress. And then you're paying a neurobiological price for that entertainment. So why do we get more violence, promiscuity, and attention problems with TV? Because we get a different brain that's less capable of self-restraint. All right, section 4, spiritual factors affecting brain. Meditation, and I went through the meditation study on this morning that you meditate on a God of love, you actually grow anterior cingulate cortex and calm amygdala with better memory and lower heart rate and blood pressure, 12 minutes a day for 30 days. If you remember, one of the founders of this church suggested that you spend a thoughtful hour each day contemplating the life of Christ, especially the closing scenes, because the closing scenes of his life are the culmination of the expression of love in action. So meditating an hour a day will change your brain, contemplating and meditating on a God of love like this. So activates the prefrontal cortex. So spiritual factors which activate the prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex result in greater mental and physical health. Activities, spiritual factors which activate the fear circuits, however, you're worshiping a God that incites fear instead of a God that activates the love circuits, you're going to get more mental and physical health problems. So, loving God constructs are healing. All other God constructs, angry, wrathful, punitive, distant, are damaging. So, which is more scientifically accurate, Charles Darwin or the Bible? Notice, scientifically accurate now, guys. We're talking science. Well, this is a picture of Darwin's finches. Anybody remember Darwin's finches? Okay, he's observed the finches, and this is a drawing of the finches. And you notice these finches have all these different beaks. You notice all the different beaks? And these were adapted for grubs, and these were fruits, and these are adapted for leaves, and these are adapted for seeds, and so forth and so on. And so he hypothesized and postulated that there were radiation. Notice this, adaptive radiation. Radiation caused mutation that caused a beak change that made this type of beak more adaptive for fruit buds and buds and fruits, and so these reproduced and survived competitively against the others who couldn't do that, and that's why this was radiation DNA sequencing altered mutation. In reality, what we've now shown in science is documented and proven that all of these finches have the same DNA sequence. There's no mutation. They have epigenetic modification based on experience that happens in 1 to 2 generations. And this is, and the Bible says, of course, visiting the iniquities of the fathers to the children on the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, showing loving kindness to thousands of those who keep my commandments. So what's the Bible saying is that our iniquities, our sins are passed down 3 and 4 generations instantly. Why? Do you see why from this program? Why is this God saying, okay, you break my rules, I'm going to use my power to punish your kids? Is that what he's saying? No. He's saying, I built you in my image and gave you the ability to create beings in your image. And if you violate my design protocol, you'll alter yourself and you'll pass the damage down to your kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids. So, what does the commandment mean? Our choices change us, unhealthy choices damage us. And what does hating God have to do with passing iniquity to later generations? Well, love calms the amygdala and grows the anterior cingulate cortex. This is epigenetic change, which leads to healing. So those who love God experience that merciful transformation. But the hate activates the amygdala with subsequent inflammatory cascades, which damage. So, healthy brain optimized by, I'll put these up, and I'll walk through them. Healthy parents. First thing, healthy parents. I know we all got to choose our parents, but those of you who are young enough can start thinking about that. You can become healthy before you have kids and make healthy in your life before you have them. You can actually, just like those mice with the enriched environment, shut down some defective genes to pass on some positive attributes to their kids. So healthy parents, a healthy intrauterine environment. So if you get pregnant, you should plan on being as healthy as you can during that time period to keep yourself mentally calm, avoid a lot of anxiety, and eat healthy during that time. Proper nutrition, both for the mom and then for the children afterwards. Affection and responsive parents, so that the child is born into the world where the child gets a lot of love, affection, and attention in proper ways. Caressing, stroking, this changes the brain, as we saw. Physical activity. This is one of the great errors in our educational system. We have taken away physical activity from the kids. Kids need physical activity. We now study, the part of the brain called the cerebellum. This is the part of the brain that makes coordinate smooth muscle control, smooth motor control, so that as we move, we can move very smoothly and coordinated, and coordinates our movements and stuff. Well, we've now discovered that not only does the cerebellum do that, but the central part called the vermis of the cerebellum actually helps coordinate smooth thinking. It organizes your thoughts. Additionally, the part of the brain that initiates motor movement, which is dysfunctional Parkinson's disease, and people that have Parkinson's disease have difficult time moving, well, that part of the brain also helps initiate thinking and speech, and that's why a lot of people with Parkinson's disease have slowed thought processes, because that part of the brain is impaired. Physical activity helps the brain develop healthy, and it's an integral part of a child's development. So if you're homeschooling, be sure your child gets lots of playtime. It's very important they get that exercise. Let's see, physical activity. Stimulate the 5 senses. So kids should get some exposure to art and music and some of these things to stimulate those parts of their brain. Avoidance of toxic substances, and there's many of those in our environment. Education, of course, we want to educate our children, have them develop those various capacities that they have. Avoid theatrical television. Theatrical television, educational television is okay. You should really minimize theatrical television. Healthy spirituality, teach your kids God's design for the way He built things to run. Disabuse them of this imposed dictatorial Roman emperor God construct that they need to run and hide from. And then healthy sleep. Sleep is critical. There are 4 physical requirements to life: air, I bet you knew that one, water, food, and sleep. Sleep is a physical requirement. And many of the teens don't know this. They don't. I have late adolescents, 19 college students that come see me, and they think that sleep can be compromised with. But it can't be. You can't make up for sleep with stimulants. Sleep deprivation. So, summary, the brain is highly complex and susceptible to change. Environment causes marked changes in brain development. Environment alters gene expression, which is passed down through the generations, and following God's methods as described in Scripture promotes a healthy brain.